Long ago, the Israelites lived in Egypt. They were not always slaves. They first came to Egypt because of a great famine. A wise Israelite named Joseph had become a powerful leader in Egypt. He saved the country from starvation. The Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, was very grateful. He invited Joseph's entire family to come and live in the fertile land of Goshen. For many years, the Israelites lived there in peace and prosperity. They were respected guests, and their families grew large. Their numbers increased, and they became a strong and numerous people within the borders of Egypt, living happily alongside their Egyptian neighbors. However, as time passed, the good old days came to an end. A new pharaoh rose to power in Egypt. This pharaoh did not know Joseph or remember the great things he had done. He looked at the growing population of Israelites with fear and suspicion. He saw their large numbers not as a blessing but as a threat. He worried that if a war came, the Israelites might join Egypt's enemies. They could fight against the Egyptians and escape from the land. This fear turned into a cruel plan. The new pharaoh decided he had to control the Israelites and stop them from becoming any more powerful. To break their spirit and control their growth, the pharaoh made the Israelites slaves. He forced them into hard labor, a life of endless toil under the hot Egyptian sun. They were ordered to build great cities for the pharaoh, cities like Pithom and Ramesses. They worked with mud and straw to make millions of bricks. They labored in the fields, digging and planting. Egyptian taskmasters, cruel and demanding, were placed over them. These taskmasters beat the Israelites and made their lives bitter and miserable. The work was difficult and painful, designed to crush them completely, but their spirit didn't die. Despite the harsh conditions and the pharaoh's cruel intentions, the Israelites continued to grow in number. The harder the Egyptians oppressed them, the more they multiplied. This made the pharaoh even more afraid and angry. His plan to weaken them was not working as he had hoped. He decided to take an even more terrible and heartless step. He gave a horrific order to his people. He commanded that every baby boy born to the Israelites must be thrown into the great Nile River and drowned. He hoped this would stop the Israelites from growing and finally end the threat he imagined they posed to his kingdom. During this terrible time of slavery and fear, a brave Israelite woman named Jochebed gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. She saw that her son was special, and her heart was filled with love for him. She could not bear the thought of following the Pharaoh's evil command. She knew she had to protect her child from the soldiers who would take him to the river. For 3 months she managed to hide him in her home, keeping him quiet and safe from watchful eyes. Every cry was muffled and every day was filled with anxiety, but her love for her son gave her strength to defy the king's decree. As the baby grew, it became harder and harder to keep him hidden. His cries grew louder, and the risk of being discovered became too great. Jochebed knew she needed a new plan to save her son's life. With a heavy heart, she wove a small basket from papyrus reeds, the same plants that grew along the riverbank. She carefully coated the basket with tar and pitch to make it waterproof, turning it into a tiny, floating ark. She gently placed her beloved baby inside the basket, then she carried the basket to the Nile River, the very place of death, and set it afloat among the tall reeds near the bank. Jochebed did not leave her son's fate entirely to chance. She asked her daughter, a young girl named Miriam, to watch from a distance. Miriam hid herself and kept a careful eye on the small basket as it bobbed gently in the water. She was waiting to see what would happen to her baby brother. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was about to occur. The Pharaoh's own daughter came down to the river to bathe, along with her attendants. As she walked along the bank, she noticed the strange little basket hidden among the reeds. She was curious and sent one of her maids to bring it to her. When the princess opened the basket, she saw the baby boy inside. He was crying, and her heart was immediately filled with compassion for him. She knew right away that this must be one of the Hebrew babies. At that moment, brave Miriam stepped out from her hiding place. She approached the princess and cleverly asked, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" The princess agreed at once. Miriam ran and brought her own mother, Jochebed. The princess hired her to care for the baby, not knowing she was his real mother. The princess named the baby Moses because she had drawn him out of the water. Moses grew up in the royal palace of Egypt. He was raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He received the best education and learned the ways of the Egyptian court. He lived a life of luxury and privilege, far from the suffering of his own people. However, Moses never forgot that he was an Israelite. One day, when he was a grown man, he went out to see his people. He saw an Egyptian taskmaster brutally beating an Israelite slave. Filled with anger at this injustice, Moses looked around to see if anyone was watching. Seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and buried his body in the sand. Moses thought his act was a secret, but it was not. The very next day he went out again and saw two Israelites fighting with each other. He tried to stop them, but one of them angrily replied, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was terrified when he heard this. He realized that what he had done was known. Soon the Pharaoh also heard about the murder. He was furious and ordered that Moses be put to death. To save his life, Moses had to flee from Egypt. He ran far away into the desert to a land called Midian. In the land of Midian, Moses became a shepherd. He married a woman named Zipporah and started a new, quiet life. He worked for his father-in-law, Jethro, taking care of his flocks. For many years, he lived the simple life of a shepherd, wandering through the wilderness with the sheep. One day he led his flock to the far side of the desert and came to a mountain called Horeb, the mountain of God. There he saw a truly amazing sight. He saw a bush that was completely on fire with flames leaping from its branches. But the bush was not burning up. It was not turning to ash. Moses was filled with curiosity and wonder. He decided to go closer to see this incredible thing for himself. As he approached the burning bush, a powerful voice called out to him from the flames. "Moses! Moses!" the voice said. It was the voice of God. God told Moses to take off his sandals because he was standing on holy ground. God then told Moses that he had seen the terrible suffering of the Israelites in Egypt. He had heard their cries for help. God declared that he had come down to rescue them and bring them to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and he had chosen Moses to carry out this mission. God commanded Moses to return to Egypt. He was to go to the Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites. Moses was full of doubt and fear. He did not think he was the right person for such a huge task. He made excuses, saying he was not a good speaker, but God promised to be with him and help him. God gave Moses' brother, Aaron, to be his spokesman. Together, Moses and Aaron went back to Egypt. They stood before the mighty Pharaoh and delivered God's message. "Let my people go so that they may worship me in the wilderness." But the Pharaoh's heart was hard. He arrogantly refused. Because the Pharaoh refused to listen, God began to send a series of terrible disasters, known as the 10 plagues, upon the land of Egypt. The first plague turned all the water in the Nile River into blood. The river, which was the source of life for Egypt, became a source of death. All the fish in the river died, and the water was undrinkable. The Egyptians had to dig for fresh water. Still, the Pharaoh would not let the people go, so God sent the second plague, frogs. Frogs came up from the river and swarmed everywhere. They were in the palaces, in the houses, and even in the beds and ovens of the Egyptians. After the frogs, God sent swarms of gnats and then flies. These tiny insects covered the people and the animals, making life miserable. But these plagues affected only the Egyptians. The land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was spared. The Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Next, a terrible disease killed the livestock of the Egyptians, their horses, donkeys, camels, and cattle. This was followed by a plague of painful boils that broke out on the skin of the Egyptians and their animals. Then came the most destructive plague yet, a hailstorm of fire and ice that destroyed crops and shattered everything it touched in the fields. Even after all this destruction, the Pharaoh stubbornly refused to obey God. So God sent a plague of locusts. A giant swarm of locusts flew in and covered the entire land of Egypt. They ate every green thing that the hail had left behind, leaving the land completely bare. After the locusts, God sent a thick, supernatural darkness that covered Egypt for 3 days. The Egyptians could not see each other or move from their places. It was a terrifying darkness that could be felt, but in the homes of the Israelites, there was light. Each plague was a powerful demonstration, showing that the God of the Israelites was more powerful than the Pharaoh and all the gods of Egypt. After the 9th plague of darkness, God prepared to send one final devastating plague. This one would be the most terrible of all, and it would finally break the Pharaoh's stubborn will. God spoke to Moses and gave him very specific instructions for the Israelites. This was to be a special night of remembrance, a night that would be celebrated for all generations to come. God told Moses that at midnight he would pass through the land of Egypt. In every Egyptian household, the firstborn son would die. From the firstborn of the Pharaoh on his throne to the firstborn of the slave girl, no Egyptian family would be spared. To protect the Israelites from this final plague, God gave them a sacred ritual to follow. Each family was to take a perfect 1-year-old lamb without any defects. They were to slaughter the lamb at twilight. Then they were to take some of the lamb's blood and mark the doorposts and the top of the doorframe of their houses with it. The blood on the door would be a sign. When God passed through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he would see the blood and pass over those houses. The people inside would be safe from the plague of death that was sweeping through the rest of the land. Inside their homes, the Israelites were to roast the lamb and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The unleavened bread, made without yeast, reminded them that they had to leave Egypt in a hurry with no time to let their bread rise. The bitter herbs symbolized the bitterness of their slavery. They were to eat this meal fully dressed, with their sandals on their feet and their staff in their hand, ready to leave at a moment's notice. They followed God's commands exactly, sharing this solemn meal while waiting for the moment of their liberation. It was the very first Passover. At midnight, everything happened just as God had said. A great cry of grief went up throughout the land of Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. The Pharaoh himself was struck by the tragedy. His own firstborn son died. Finally, his proud and stubborn heart was broken. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. He told them to get up and leave, to take all the Israelites and their flocks and herds, and to go. The Egyptian people, desperate for the Israelites to leave, urged them to go quickly. They gave the Israelites silver, gold, and clothing just to get them to depart. And so, after 430 years, the Israelites finally marched out of Egypt as a free people. The long-awaited journey to freedom had finally begun. Hundreds of thousands of Israelites, along with their livestock, left the cities of Egypt behind. They were no longer slaves, but a nation on the move, heading towards the promise of a new home. God did not lead them by the shortest route, which went through the land of the Philistines. He knew the people were not ready for war. Instead, God guided them on a longer path towards the wilderness of the Red Sea. He led them personally, showing his constant presence. During the day, he went before them as a majestic pillar of cloud to show them the way. At night, he led them as a brilliant pillar of fire to give them light. However, the Israelites' freedom was not yet secure. Back in Egypt, once the shock and grief had passed, the Pharaoh had a change of heart. He and his officials regretted letting their entire workforce go. "What have we done?" they asked. "We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." The Pharaoh's pride returned, and he decided to chase after them. He quickly gathered his army, including his 600 best chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt, with an officer in each one. He was determined to recapture the Israelites and force them back into slavery. The mighty Egyptian army thundered across the desert in pursuit. The Israelites were camped by the edge of the Red Sea when they looked up and saw the dust cloud of the approaching army. The sight of the Pharaoh's chariots filled them with absolute terror. They felt trapped. The vast, uncrossable sea was in front of them, and the most powerful army in the world was behind them. Fear turned to anger, and they cried out to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" they shouted. "It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." They had lost all hope and believed their end was near. But Moses stood firm in his faith. He told the terrified people, "Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then, following God's command, Moses raised his staff and stretched his hand out over the sea. All through that night, God sent a strong east wind that blew across the water. A great miracle happened. The waters of the Red Sea divided, piling up like two great walls on either side. A path of dry land appeared right through the middle of the sea, and the Israelites walked across to safety. After their miraculous escape through the Red Sea, the Israelites found themselves in the vast and unforgiving Sinai desert. The initial joy of freedom quickly gave way to the harsh realities of their new environment. The land was dry, rocky, and empty. There was very little food and almost no water. After 3 days of walking, they came to a place called Mara, but the water there was bitter and undrinkable. The people began to complain against Moses, their fear and thirst, making them forget the incredible miracles they had just witnessed. They cried out, "What are we to drink?" Their journey to the promised land seemed impossible from the very start. Moses cried out to the Lord for help, and God showed him a piece of wood. When Moses threw the wood into the bitter water, it miraculously became sweet and fresh, and the people could finally drink. This was just the first of many tests in the wilderness. Soon after, the food they had brought with them from Egypt ran out. Once again, the people grumbled against Moses and Aaron. They remembered the food they had in Egypt, even as slaves, and wished they had died there with full stomachs. They accused Moses of bringing them into the desert just to starve them all to death. Their faith was weak, and their memory of God's power was short. In response to their cries, God once again provided for his people in a miraculous way. He told Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you." The next morning, when the dew that covered the ground had evaporated, the Israelites saw a strange substance. It was a thin, flaky material, as fine as frost, covering the desert floor. The people had never seen anything like it, and asked, "What is it?" which in Hebrew is manna. Moses told them it was the bread the Lord had given them to eat. Every morning for the next 40 years, this manna appeared, providing just enough food for each day. Later in their journey, the people again found themselves without water. They camped at a place called Rephidim, and their thirst led them to quarrel with Moses once more. They were on the verge of stoning him. God commanded Moses to take his staff, the same staff he used to part the Red Sea, and go to a specific rock at Horeb. In front of the elders of Israel, Moses was to strike the rock. He obeyed, and as soon as his staff hit the rock, water gushed out from it in a torrent. There was enough water for all the people and their animals to drink. Through these miracles, God taught the Israelites to depend on him for their daily needs. 3 months after leaving Egypt, the Israelites arrived at the foot of a great mountain in the heart of the desert. This was Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. Here, they would have their most important encounter with the Lord. God called Moses to come up the mountain. He told Moses that if the people of Israel would obey him fully and keep his covenant, they would be his treasured possession out of all the nations, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The people heard this message and agreed together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." They prepared themselves for 3 days to meet their God. On the morning of the 3rd day, the people witnessed an awe-inspiring and terrifying sight. A thick cloud descended upon Mount Sinai, covering its peak. There was thunder and lightning, and a very loud trumpet blast that made everyone in the camp tremble with fear. The entire mountain was enveloped in smoke because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The smoke billowed up like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently. The people stood at a distance, watching in fear and wonder. God had commanded them not to touch the mountain, or they would die. Only Moses was allowed to go up into the presence of God. As Moses stood on the holy mountain, surrounded by fire and smoke, God spoke to him directly. He gave Moses a set of divine laws that would guide the Israelites and shape them into a nation. These laws were the foundation of their covenant with God. The most famous of these laws are the 10 Commandments. God spoke these 10 core principles with a loud voice for all the people to hear. They were rules for living a good and holy life, showing the people how to love God and how to love their neighbors. These laws were not just rules, they were a gift, a guide to a life of freedom and righteousness. God then inscribed these 10 commandments onto 2 tablets of stone with his own finger. The first 4 commandments deal with the people's relationship with God, to worship only him, not to make idols, to honor his name, and to keep the Sabbath day holy. The next 6 commandments focus on their relationships with each other, to honor their parents, not to murder, not to commit adultery, not to steal, not to give false testimony, and not to covet what belongs to others. These timeless laws became the moral and spiritual foundation of the Israelite nation. and have influenced laws and ethics around the world for thousands of years. Receiving the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai was a defining moment for the Israelites, but their journey was far from over. From Sinai, they traveled towards Canaan, the Promised Land. When they reached its borders, Moses sent 12 spies, one from each tribe, to explore the land. After 40 days, the spies returned. They reported that the land was indeed wonderful, flowing with milk and honey, just as God had promised. However, 10 of the spies also brought back a terrifying report. They said the cities were heavily fortified and the people living there were giants so powerful that the Israelites looked like grasshoppers in comparison. This fearful report spread panic throughout the camp. The people lost their faith completely. They wept and complained against Moses and Aaron, wishing they had died in Egypt or in the wilderness. They refused to trust in God's power to give them the land. They even talked about choosing a new leader to take them back to slavery in Egypt. Only 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, trusted in God and urged the people to go forward. As a punishment for their rebellion and lack of faith, God declared that this entire generation would not enter the Promised Land. They were sentenced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. 1 year for each day the spies were in the land, until all the adults who had rebelled had died. So began the long and difficult period of wandering in the desert. For 4 decades, the Israelites lived a nomadic life, moving from place to place. It was a time of testing, discipline, and learning. A new generation grew up, a generation that had not known slavery in Egypt. They learned to depend on God for their daily manna and water. Moses, their faithful leader, led them through all these years, teaching them God's laws and guiding them through their many challenges. However, because he himself had disobeyed God at one point, Moses was also forbidden from entering the Promised Land. He was allowed only to see it from a distance, from the top of Mount Nebo, before he died. The story of the Exodus is the central story of the Jewish people. It's a powerful tale of slavery, redemption, and the birth of a nation. It is remembered and retold every year during the festival of Passover, or Pesach. Jewish families gather for a special meal called a Seder, where they eat symbolic foods like matzah, which is unleavened bread, and bitter herbs, to remember the bitterness of slavery and the haste of their escape. While some historians question the exact details of the story, its spiritual meaning remains profound. It is a timeless story of hope, the struggle for freedom against oppression, and the enduring power of faith in a God who liberates the downtrodden.